And it's very fitting. It's a very fun program. I hope you'll feel that way when you leave the hall. We planned this actually around a very big piece, the piece of the second half, The Planets, which is a tour de force for orchestra. It calls for an extremely large orchestra. It's a kind of surround sound piece, almost larger than life. And at our brilliant annotator and historian Ed Yudzinski pointed out to me that it was an appropriate month to do the planets because this April is the 50th anniversary of the first person in space. Some of you remember Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet astronaut, the very first astronaut, 50 years ago, April, this month. So the planets is maybe fitting. And then tying into this big piece by Holst, we have another big piece, and I say big, although this piece has no trombones, no clarinets, no extra percussion. It has small forces, usually played with a small string section, although we're playing with a little bit larger section. Mozart's Final Symphony that has the sobriquet Jupiter. Now, Mozart never called this piece Jupiter Symphony, but it was named such by, I think, a music critic, music historian who was talking very justly about how this piece is at the top of Mount Olympus of symphonies. I mean, it's a king among symphonies, Jupiter being, of course, the king of the gods and to the Romans. So it's very, very fitting, and it is an extraordinary piece of music. To tell you just a little bit of things that you probably know about Mozart, Mozart spent the last 10 years of his very short life, he died at the age of 35, he spent the last 10 years in Vienna, which was very important. He had to go to Vienna. Vienna was the center of the music world. You know, he had to go and ply his trade in Vienna, so to speak. So he spent those 10 years, very challenging 10 years for him. It was, particularly the last 3 or 4 years were extremely difficult for Mozart for a variety of reasons in Vienna. First of all, I mean, you probably will have seen or read the play or the movie Amadeus. Vienna was a place of enormous intrigue, and Mozart had many, many composers and musicians who were not happy that he arrived in Vienna with a kind of reputation that he had as an unbelievable child prodigy and miraculous artist. And they did the best they could to stop his success in Vienna. And Mozart was a person who was really from the country and very innocent in many ways, and was not really equipped to deal with the kind of court intrigue and political machinations that he found in Vienna, and he didn't handle them well, and as a result he was not successful. And towards the end of those 10 years, he was really being blocked in almost every way by people who were not trying to help him. The Viennese public also was very fickle. They were the kind of people who would love a composer for 6 months and then want the new person or what was different, and they were not very loyal to their artists. Mozart also joined the Freemasons, and that was a very powerful group at that time, but it was beginning to be the subject of a kind of growing prejudice against Freemasons. And even though Mozart was supported a great deal by the members of the Masons, there was some difficulty at that time of being accepted because he was a Mason. He had a great success in Prague towards the end of his life. Prague was a city that adored him. Those of you who have been to that part of Europe know that Vienna and Prague are quite close together. But the Viennese resented that. They considered Prague an inferior city, and Mozart's success there and the fact that the people loved him. He premiered his opera Don Giovanni there. He wrote the Prague Symphony for the city of Prague, worked against him in Vienna. But the most significant a difficulty for Mozart was his music itself. His music was growing in complexity. It was growing in a kind of profound maturity that was not really popular at the time. Mozart in his early life followed his father's directive, and that was to write music that people liked. And he did. He wrote music that was very appealing to the public. At this stage in his life, he's not as concerned with that. He's writing music that's in a different level. I mean, Mozart in his mind is deepening in his sophistication of writing music, and it became music that people didn't understand. It was less accessible. It was no longer easy to listen to, or social music, the kind of court music that the Viennese liked. They didn't want to be challenged too much by music. They wanted simply to have a good time. And his listeners became puzzled by it, and then they rejected it. They rejected him. Some of you remember the famous words of the emperor after listening to a piece by Mozart and not really understanding it, telling Mozart that it needed some work, and Mozart was dismayed and said, "Well, what's wrong with it, Your Highness?" And the emperor had no idea what to say because he didn't know. He simply said to him, "It has too many notes." And I think you remember that famous statement. But that's a kind of, it was kind of indicative of the public not really understanding where Mozart was going in his music. And I say that because this symphony is kind of the quintessential symphony at that time of Mozart's thinking. In 1788, Mozart was living in poverty. I mean, he had really lost all of his contacts, and he wasn't being hired to write music. He wasn't able to mount subscription concerts. Essentially, it was too early for what one person said in a very beautiful way. It was too early for the emancipation of the creative spirit. Mozart couldn't exist as a composer on his own. He couldn't exist as an artist. He had to work for someone. He had to work for the court or for the church, or that was the way things were, and it was too early for that to change. Beethoven later would change that, or at least would begin to change that. Mozart couldn't change it. So he, not being successful in that world, he was living in complete poverty, and he had to keep moving further and further outside of Vienna to cheaper and cheaper lodgings. And he said, and this is very poignant, he wrote in a letter that he didn't mind living so far out of town because no one ever came to see him, and he never had any meetings or engagements in the city, so at least this way he could be quiet and he could work by himself. So he was living far on the outskirts of town. And in the summer of 1788, the time he was very ill, he wrote 3 symphonies in a very quick succession, just in the summertime, his last 3, 39, 40, and 41. This one, which we'll hear, 41, the final one he wrote in 3 weeks in that summer. And he didn't write these pieces for anybody. He didn't write them for performances. He had no performances planned. He had no sponsors. He had no possibilities. He wrote them because he had to write them. And he never heard them except in his head. They were never played in his lifetime. And these 3 symphonies, which we know is this great trilogy, is vastly important in the history of music, really had no impact on his life. He wrote them and he put them in his drawer and never heard them. And we listen to this music today, and it is such a miracle. And the fact that Mozart was probably one of the darkest periods of his life, this music bears no trace of that. The music is a kind of perfect expression of joy, especially the last movement. It's the quintessential joy in the deepest sense, not a kind of surface happiness, but incredible joy. And so it shows us that as much as we think that composers reflect what they're going through in their lives in their music, it's not always true. I mean, Mozart wrote music that was from another life, somewhere inside his head, this incredible miracle of a piece, probably the greatest symphony ever written. The 4th movement, especially the finale, is a tour de force of counterpoint. And maybe you can tell that a little bit seeing it live. At one time there were 5 different voices going on, all in perfect accord, perfect harmony, the different voices blending miraculously with each other. If you watch the orchestra, you can see sections coming in, the second violins, the first violins, the double basses, the cellos, all layering this incredibly complicated texture together. It's amazing. I mean, the technique involved is staggering to be able to do this. But Mozart was too musical to ever betray that to you. I mean, if you just listen to the piece, you just hear this wonderful sense of joy and propulsion and energy and buoyancy. This is what this movement is about. He doesn't show any of the technique inside. It's really just a masterpiece of triumph and of a kind of lightness of spirit that has never been equaled by anyone, this last movement. The second movement, too, I want you to listen to especially carefully, if you would, because it's very elegant, it's very poised, it's very balanced, as all of Mozart is. But it betrays what was happening to Mozart and where he was going. Mozart is actually beginning to write pure music that is romantic. He's beginning to lead us into what would be the Romantic period. And you listen in the second movement, you can hear that. This is way before Beethoven pushed us into the Romantic period. Mozart was already starting. His music at the end of his life was leading us. It was leading in that direction. So if he hadn't died at the age of 35, I feel for sure music that we know would be different, because everyone was influenced by what he wrote, every composer after him. And if he had lived another 5 years, another 10 years, he would have changed the shape of music. Music that we hear today would be different. But as it is, we have this incredible legacy of this Jupiter symphony. So even though it's much smaller than the planets, it is a towering masterpiece, as you will hear. Second half, we turn to Holst the Planets, which is much bigger. Lots of extra musicians come on the stage, a tenor tuba, wonderful alto flute, a kind of a bass-voiced flute, which you'll hear. Holst wrote this piece between 1914 and 1916, and when it was played in 1916, everyone said, oh, he wrote it because he was inspired by World War I, of course, which was the cataclysmic event of that time. And that's because the first movement, which you probably will recognize, is called Mars, the Bringer of War. And that piece was so arresting that they thought it must be about this war that we lived through. And Holst said absolutely not. He said that the piece was not based on war. It was based upon his interest in mysticism and his fascination with the character that he imagined each planet had, the personality, the character of each planet, nothing at all about war. And he put together seven movements. At that time, he left Earth out because he didn't want to include that in the suite. And Pluto had not been discovered yet. Pluto was discovered, I think, in the 30s, so Pluto has not been discovered. But since then, as many of you know, Pluto has been discredited as a planet. So we actually are back to only 8 planets. So Holst's suite is complete. We don't need another movement. But each one of these 7 bears, of course, the title of the planet and his idea of personality of the planet, which is sometimes tied to the god for which the planet is named. For instance, we start with Mars. Mars was the god of war. And this is a crushing, overwhelming, sonic spectacular of a kind of an inexorable war machine. It's in 5. It's in the meter 5, which is kind of interesting. Da-ga-da-dum, bum, 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 da-ga-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. 5 beats over and over and over again, which is not so common in music. It's filled with power, kind of a savage power, fury. He wanted to show, he said, the mindlessness of war. And there is a kind of element of that, of this driving force that never stops. The sound is overwhelming in Mars, and it's an amazing movement. After that comes Venus. Venus, what he calls in the suite the bringer of peace. Of course, Venus was the goddess of love, and it's kind of a gentle benediction after Mars, tranquil, regenerative, soothing. There's this sense of calmness and serenity that's very beautiful. After that comes Mercury. Mercury, the god of, Mercury was the messenger of the gods, the winged messenger. And also he was associated with the quickness of the mind. So this movement darts around all over the place. It's fast, it's difficult for the musicians. Everyone plays little rapid passages coming from all the different sections in the orchestra. It's restless all the way through, it's dazzling. It's a kind of kaleidoscope of shifts, of constant little running motions, as you'll hear, as Mercury darts all over the place. Jupiter, the next one, is the most famous. Jupiter, the bringer of jollity. Jupiter, the king of the gods. But to Holst, I think Jupiter represented the kind of quintessential English gentleman, filled with robust good cheer and fellowship and high spirits. You'll hear this because it's the most English sounding of the pieces. It's very English, and it's just filled with a kind of English goodwill, as you'll hear, a kind of mixture of lofty nobility in moments, and also sort of folk music, which Holst was very, very fond of, English folk music. It became so popular that the middle section is actually a kind of patriotic song in England. It was given words, and people still sing this middle section. And Holst had a memory of the first rehearsal of this piece that he always cherished. The London Symphony was rehearsing for the concert, and the char women were getting the hall cleaned while the rehearsal was going on. And so they were in the lobby, and someone, while this movement was being played, someone told Holst to go out and look in the lobby. All the char women had put down their mops and their brushes, and they were all dancing to this music. When you hear this, you'll understand why. They just couldn't resist this movement. Next comes Saturn. You know, Saturn's that mysterious planet with the rings around it, which you'll hear more about. Saturn, the bringer of old age. This is the most philosophical movement. It was Holst's favorite, and it depicts the inexorable onset of age, starting with a clock in the flutes. You'll hear them playing 2 chords going back and forth like a tick-tock. The rhythm never shifts. The basses represent old age. It's rare that you hear the bass section playing by themselves, but the bass section plays. And then the trombones begin this kind of dreary spectral march, which mounts up into frenzy. It actually becomes very frightening. It's at the climax, it's a very frightening movement. But at the end of this movement, this is sort of a kind of serene postlude, almost a kind of acceptance of the inevitable, or maybe a vision of what happens afterwards, fulfillment of life after death. It's very, very peaceful and very beautiful at the end of this. So it maybe gives us a window into what Holst considered comes after death. The next one is Orchestra, the magician. He makes Orchestra a magician, and he's a kind of malevolent magician too. I mean, we can imagine he's a giant. He's kind of striding through the heavens, knocking stars around, and his laughter is shaking the heavens. And he's summoned by 4 weighty brass chords in the trombone and tuba. So you'll hear it. It's very, very alarming. After the peacefulness of Saturn, these 4 big chords bring us this magician. And he comes swaggering in with this march, which is really very appealing music, where the orchestra plays this great music of this magician. And then they build up to a big climax, and all of a sudden, he does what magicians sometimes do. He disappears. And you'll hear that moment. I mean, it builds up to a tremendous fortissimo, then almost silence. We have a few string players playing, but they're the players sitting in the back of the section. So you may hear strings, you may be looking at the front stands and see nothing. The players in the back are playing as Orchestra disappears. The final movement, the most mysterious, Neptune, and he calls Neptune the mystic. This is a kind of piece that's sort of set in the outer regions of space, mysterious, an infinity where there are no answers, there are no questions. Even the key is unclear because he has 2 keys going on at once, as if there's 2 keys floating there. We're not sure. We can't really pin it down. The orchestra plays quietly throughout, and they get softer and softer and softer. We hear little glimmers, but generally they get softer and softer. And then they're joined at a certain point by a wordless chorus. They're not singing words, they're just singing syllables. And they're hidden. Holst specified that the chorus had to be hidden. So we have the women of the Buffalo Philharmonic chorus are hidden in Kleinhans. So you won't see them till they take their bow. But you'll hear them. And this is maybe like the music of the spheres. It goes on and on and on and on. They get softer and softer and softer. And finally they fade out. I'm not even sure when they stop singing because they're moving away from us in their hidden space. And the idea, of course, with Holst is that this music goes on forever. It's the music of eternity, or the music of the spheres that is always with us, and the piece ends very quietly. But it's quite dramatic. And we have a wonderful collaboration, and I'm going to ask Dr. Kevin Williams to come out, introduce you to him, and tell you about this exciting collaboration. So we welcome Dr. Kevin Williams. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Dr. Williams is Assistant Professor of Geology in the Department of Earth Sciences, and he's also the director of the Whitworth Ferguson Planetarium. And I hope that all of you have been there. If not, you're going to be definitely inspired to go at Buffalo State College, our planetarium, our Buffalo Planetarium. In addition to his duties as director of the planetarium and teaching as well, Dr. Williams also conducts research specializing in the geology of other planets. It was very interesting. After he received his doctorate in planetary geology from Arizona State University. Dr. Williams continued to study and to conduct research at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington before he came to Buffalo State and became director of the planetarium. So we have, I think, our first ever collaboration with the planetarium, and we're delighted about that. And we're going to welcome one other guest. And this was a surprise to me. As of yesterday, I learned that Dan Sweely, a member of our horn section, who is going to join us in a moment, I'll tell you why. Here he is. Here comes Dan. Dan Sweely, whom you recognize from our horn section. Dan joined the orchestra. Dan joined the orchestra in 2000, and after knowing him all these years, I found out yesterday for the first time that while he was a music major, he was also studying astronomy. He was an astronomy minor. So I said, Dan, you've got to be part of this. This makes him, I think, at least I know for sure, unique in our orchestra. We have no astronomy studiers in the orchestra, but maybe as a musician it might be a unique combination. So how do you feel about playing the planets with your dual interests?
Well, I told her yesterday, and I told the patrons yesterday that a couple days ago when I heard we were doing this visual aspect to this performance as well, it finally dawned on me that it'd probably be the one and only time in my career when I could combine my music degrees that I have with the astronomy minor, and it'd be about the only time that'd ever be relevant. So I felt the need for her to know about that information.
Well, I'm very glad. So he's now part of this. But I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to tell us a little bit about what's in store for us during the concert.
For the pre-concert talk here, I just wanted to give all of you a little bit of introduction to some of the images you'll see in the second half of the concert. As you know, the piece is called The Planets, so I wanted to first of all tell you that the order of the planets in Holst's piece is different from the actual order. As JoAnn mentioned, the reason Holst wrote the pieces was to bring about the astrological and mystic parts of them, and Mars was actually seen as an important part of people's lives. But as you can see, and as you probably know, Mercury is actually the closest planet to the Sun. And as we look at the planets, as you know, Pluto is no longer a planet. It's been demoted. And we have 8 major planets, which include the Earth. And what I want you to notice from this diagram is just how small Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars are compared to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. As you can see, Jupiter is the largest of the planets, the god of the gods, and is the largest in the solar system. And as we look at these 8 planets, if you can see that, the very small dots you see there, Earth is the largest of those. Those are the planets that are rocky, have solid surfaces. The other 4 planets, the large gas giants, are mainly gas at the surfaces anyway, and so they don't have solid surfaces. My background, as you heard, is in geology of planets, and so what you're going to be seeing in the second half of the concert are images of the surfaces of the planets and also the surfaces of the moons of some of the larger planets. Because they're a bit like small planets themselves. And so a lot of times I like showing pictures like this, which when I talk to folks coming into the planetarium and show them pictures like this, they think it's the moon. This is actually Mercury, so the closest planet to the Sun. And this image right here was just released on Friday from a new spacecraft that has just entered the orbit of Mercury. Actually on St. Patrick's Day, and over the next year or two we're going to be getting a lot more information about Mercury and learning about its history. And what amazes me about some of these missions is just the technology that they have. We're not just talking about a digital camera on a spacecraft. We're talking about an elaborate set of cameras and telescopes, and what we're seeing here is a view of the Earth and the Moon as seen from Mercury. So this is the Mercury Messenger spacecraft looking back at us and taking a picture, and we're pretty small. But and that reminds me, I wanted to mention too, as we see the images later in the concert, you'll be seeing images from a lot of different spacecraft, and just to give you a sense that it's not just sending a robot out and taking some pictures. There's a years-long plan that they try to follow to visit the planets as often as possible. So if we're sending a spacecraft to Pluto, we're going to take pictures of any other planets we pass.
Dan, when you were studying, of course you studied images like this. Has the technology changed a lot since that's 15 years ago when you were studying astronomy?
Yeah, it was more like about 25 years ago when I started my undergraduate degree, and I was at the University of Michigan, and that's one of the more prominent astronomy departments in the country. But with cutting edge technology, but that was 25 years ago, and it's amazing how much it changes, how quickly it changes. So.
You mentioned, Kevin, that these messenger picture takers actually have had a longer life than anyone anticipated.
Yeah, definitely. It's a testament to the engineers, really. Thinking about how we look at a planet like Venus here next. When we look at Venus with a regular camera, you would be seeing clouds here. If we use different technology, we'd see through the clouds and be able to see the surface. And kind of answering your question about missions lasting longer than they expect, Mars is a great example of that. They have satellites that have been sent to Mars, so they orbit around the planet. And they're designed to last about 2 years, but then they last 10 or 12. And then
we continually get images. That one of Mars always fascinated. That was Mars, right, we were looking at? I thought it was red. I always thought it was red. No, really. And so that, when you showed me that, I was shocked. Why did they call it the red planet then?
Actually, when you see it from Earth, when we're looking up in the night sky and Mars is in the sky, it does look red because of the light being reflected off of the planet and then coming to the Earth has a reddish color. But you're right, as you look up close to it, it has more of an orange or rusty color, and that's because some of the minerals in the rocks have actually rusted. So we're looking at rust that's
meaning
been blown.
that there was water on the planet at one point, or maybe still, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence actually that there used to be a lot of water, most of us think, on Mars, but that was a little while ago, about 3 billion years. And they've had some major climate change on Mars. And just looking at the images, some of them are more like pieces of art in some ways. You look at it and you're not sure at first what you're looking at. It might look like a tree that's been cut in half, but we're looking at layers of sand and dust that have been inside a crater. We're looking at active sand dunes, so areas on Mars where sand and dust are actually being blown around today. We're looking at the insides of craters where the layers that we're seeing are telling us a story of the history of Mars. So the way I explain it to my classes and folks who come into the planetarium is that the layers that you see in the rocks are like pages in a book. So we're studying the story of the history of Mars or the history of whatever planet we're looking at. And yeah, this picture here was taken by one of the rovers on Mars, Opportunity, which landed with its twin Spirit back in January of 2007, and 2004, and they were guaranteed to last 90 days. And it's just
still going. They're
still going. Opportunity is still working more than 7 years later. So again, the technology, the engineers who put these together are amazing. And moving out to the outer planets, we see Jupiter and its different layers of gas, and down at the bottom you can see one of its moons. We'll see lots of pictures of that later. Saturn with the rings. Saturn is the one with the obvious rings because they're kind of more populated. But Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune all have rings themselves.
What are the rings made up of?
Mostly ice chunks, and not too big, maybe about the size of your head or a car, so not
small,
big.
Yeah, small.
Yeah,
ice
small chunks of ice, and some rocky chunks in there too. Moving out to Uranus, we see this nice deep blue color because the gases now are different than you have in Jupiter and Saturn, where we're dealing with a lot of methane, but we can actually look at the planets in different ways with different types of cameras, and we see now we're looking at temperature. We can see certain hot areas and cool areas on Uranus, and there the rings are showing up too. And what's weird about Uranus is that it's pretty much tilted 90 degrees. You're probably aware that the Earth is tilted about 23 degrees. Uranus is almost 90 degrees. And then lastly, Neptune. Again, this nice blue color, but we can see some different combinations of colors there.
Do we know the least about the planets that are furthest away? I just wondered.
We have the least information. Yeah, with Uranus and Neptune, the only spacecraft that have visited them are the Voyager spacecraft back in the 1980s, and we can also look at them with telescopes, but we get more information if we're up close.
Yeah. Wow, amazing. Amazing. Let me ask Dan now, looking at these, because it brings back a lot of memories for you probably. What got you involved in astronomy to begin with?
Well, excuse me. My school district that I attended, where I grew up in Lansing, Michigan, was one of the few at the time. I'm not sure if it still is one of the few, but it had a planetarium actually right in the school district. and it gave us an opportunity to go there from kindergarten, first grade, and onward 2 or 3 times a year. They always made sure they took trips to this planetarium. So I always found it really fascinating. And when I got to college at University of Michigan, I learned pretty quickly that I could elect a minor and just focus on one subject topic instead of taking all the elective courses that you have to take. So I thought it was a good opportunity to just focus on something I enjoyed and accomplish a minor as well. I didn't intend to do anything with that degree, which I certainly haven't, but it served its purpose at the time, and it was really exciting to do.
Well, and it just gives you such a breadth of knowledge that is fantastic and most musicians don't have. And interestingly, I learned that Kevin has a musical background. So how did you combine those two things? I mean, did you think about being a musician at some point?
I was never good enough, but I did play trumpet through school and then through college, and always loved it. And once I got more into research and things, I didn't have as much time, and so this opportunity to collaborate was a great opportunity to combine music and science and work it together.
Well, for us too, and you'll see as you're listening to us play the planets that Kevin has choreographed the images that you see to the music. He studied the music in great detail so that changing of the images fits in a kind of, visual ballet with the music, which is very beautiful. So, and I asked Dan about his background because I want to make the point that we have this incredible resource here in Buffalo, and I want to ask Kevin to talk to us a little bit more about the planetarium so that if you haven't been there, you don't know what we have here, I think you'll be inspired to go.
Actually, I forgot I had one more picture. I'm sorry about this. Talking about spending or sending spacecraft out to other planets, a lot of times the question comes up about why we're spending the money on it. There's the explanation that it actually employs a lot of people, but I think the more important reason is it inspires. And Dan mentioned being able to visit the planetarium as a child and being inspired with space, and experts say that to get children interested in science and math and in the arts, you need to kind of grab them by the time they're 10 years old. And the Williamsville North School District here, or the Williamsville School District has a planetarium. The Lackawanna School District has a planetarium, so they're getting young kids. We have a lot of folks coming in to the planetarium at Buffalo State. And so a little bit about that. We are open for different types of shows. We try to have something for everybody. Most of our typical or what you think of a planetarium shows are star shows. So we talk about the stars and the constellations and the planets that you can see at different times of year. We also have a series of planet shows going on this year and into next year that fits well into this concert, where next weekend we're finishing our Mercury and Venus show, and then as we move through the year we'll be visiting the other planets. So that's there. We also have some special events like laser shows. And so if you're interested in combining music and visual aspects, we have those starting on Thursday and running all through April. And I should mention that the schedule is available online. We have some of the programs have inserts in them, but we have a table in the lobby with our brochure. And if laser shows aren't your thing, we also have another combination of music and visual or visuals coming up starting in May, which combines Broadway music with some lighting effects. So again, we're trying to have something for everybody. These non-science shows are fun, and they're really meant to get folks into the planetarium and hopefully come back for some of the more astronomy-related shows.
Well, and I see that maybe the connection between music and science and astronomy is stronger than I thought when we first started this collaboration. But it's been so much fun to do this. And will you have some people from the planetarium? There's a wonderful table out in the lobby with information about the planetarium and people who are very knowledgeable about what's going on there. And at the very end, we're just going to play a little bit of something for you before we get ready for the concert. We have a brand new CD out from Naxos. Some of you might remember we played this music, the music of Joseph Suk. Joseph Suk, a great Bohemian composer. He was Dvorak's son-in-law. He was his student, and he met Dvorak's daughter and fell in love with her and married her. The music is very, very beautiful, and we're very proud of this. Our most recent Naxos disc, which we have out there also for you if you'd like to take it home. We're going to play a little bit of music from that. We'll probably fade out as our musicians come on the stage and start warming up. But if you'd like to hear a little bit, we're playing one of the tracks from this Suk. And I want to thank Dan and Kevin for being part of this, and Kevin for this fantastic experience you're about to see in the second half of the concert. So we wish you a wonderful experience.